the student bodies become more liberal, but it's not really the professor. I mean, the joke among professors is, how are we going to indoctrinate students who won't even read the syllabus?
Dave Bolger here, and welcome to Had I Known, an exploration of the Hamilton College experience. This week's guest is Professor Phil Klinkner. I never had a class with Professor Klinkner, but I've had many friends say that he is high on their list of favorite professors. And judging from the responses I've been getting, anytime I've solicited feedback on who I should have on the show, my friends are not alone, because Professor Klinkner's name repeatedly came back as one of the guests most requested people to talk to. So, for those of you who wrote to me asking for Professor Klinkner, here he is. If you have other ideas of who should be a guest on the show, definitely reach out. hadiknownshow@gmail.com. Again, hadiknownshow@gmail.com, or hadiknownshow across social media. Now, anytime you record an interview with somebody a week and a half before it actually airs, you run the risk of something changing in the world that makes your conversation irrelevant. That risk is intensified greatly when you're talking politics with someone. So I recorded this conversation with Phil about a week and a half ago, and thankfully not too much changed. This happened before the Democratic convention, so you won't hear any convention talk. But otherwise, I think we managed to avoid any major stories that we missed. But hey, I'm recording this early Sunday morning, so something could be happening now, or could still make what we're saying irrelevant. That's how fast the world moves, and that's certainly something Phil and I talk about. But given all that's going on in the world, and this being an election year, it felt like an appropriate time to bring Professor Phil Klinkner on to shed some light, share some wisdom, and depress the hell out of me about the state of the world. This is a great conversation. I certainly learned a lot. I hope you do too, and I hope you enjoy it. Here's my conversation with Professor Phil Klinkner. Hello, sir.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, no problem.
Things are heating back up for you guys, huh?
I'm just prepping for the fall. I'm going to be teaching online.
You are going to be online.
Yeah, I just got off the phone. I'm teaching a political film class.
Nice.
And I just got off the phone with a guy named Jeremy Larner, who won an Academy Award as a screenwriter for a film called The Candidate with Robert Redford. I don't know if you've ever seen it. Sure, yeah. And we're going to screen it in class, and he's going to zoom in and talk to the students in the class. So I'm really kind of excited about that. That'll be good.
Nice. And if I understand correctly, is it professors had the option to do in-person or remote, or how is that working for you guys?
So I was supposed to be in DC this semester, and that fell through because it wasn't clear that all the students were going to be able to get internships, and if they did, they'd most likely be online. And there's no point in going down to DC to sit in your apartment all day. Right. And you can't really do any, the outings and the meetings with people and stuff like that would have been a real pain. Yeah. So we, and plus just the infrastructure to sort of meet all of the needs that we have now and knock on wood, might have in the future. Yeah. If any students got sick or had to go into quarantine, it's just a lot harder to sort of handle all those issues when it's just me. And without so we pulled the plug for the fall. We'll see what's going to happen in the spring. So, I'm in St. Louis. My wife teaches at WashU. I've been here since March. And so I just took the option to teach online for that reason, among others.
So for someone who does what you do, and especially at a place like Hamilton where in-person, intimate conversations are a big part of the experience, how does the remote class work for you?
Good question. We went remote when I was doing DC in the spring, and we went remote after that. Yeah. But that was tough because, you can't really replicate DC remotely. Because it's about the internships and it's about the meetings and things like that. We did some stuff, but it was pretty difficult. So I don't know. We'll find out.
Yeah.
The two classes I'm doing are political film, which I figure they're going to be looking at screens all the time, and everybody's watching movies now. So I'll take advantage of that. And I think that's one that maybe lends itself to remote. The other class I'm going to do is political parties and elections, which is obviously very timely. But that class, the way I teach it, involves a lot of data analysis, which actually requires a lot of staring at screens together and showing them, if you want to run this correlation, you got to put in this code. And instead of staring at one screen together, we'll just sort of share screens. So I'm hoping that those classes lend themselves a little bit more to the remote teaching.
Right.
But we'll see, but the difference is that when you're on campus, you get a sort of a sense of the vibe or the environment there, and you see your students outside of class and you say, hi, how you doing, and stuff like that. Now, the only interaction you're going to have with them is either in class or if they have to meet with you about something.
Right.
You don't just sort of get this, I'm in Cafe Opus, and there's one of my students, or hey, there's Professor Klinkner, or whatever, or just the walking back to your office after class with the students going the same way who might have a question. That Zoom meeting ends and that's it.
Right.
So you lose that kind of natural, easy interaction with the students. Everything now is sort of very formal and very set.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that, I can make the content as good as what it would be in the classroom, but it's all the other stuff around it. And hopefully, the people who are teaching on campus, hopefully they can, get through the semester and work without too many hitches. But, nobody knows what's going to happen at this point. Everybody's just planning on, what we can do given what we know at this moment.
Of course.
But knowing that may change in another moment.
Yeah. Yeah. What a time to be alive, huh?
Yeah. Tell me about it.
For your political film class, are you choosing some sort of major disaster film to speak for current days?
No, I don't have, Poseidon Adventure isn't on there. Towering Inferno. No, we don't do disaster films.
Armageddon.
Yeah. No, don't have that. There's a terrible movie called The Swarm. I guess that might be good now that the murder hornets are coming for us.
Right. So election year, pandemic, race, social justice movement. What issue politically are we not thinking about or not paying attention to that's going to sneak up on us, do you think?
Well, I don't know if we have any more bandwidth to take on anything else.
Well, exactly.
This has just been a stress test this year for American governance and American democracy. Yeah. And we're barely halfway through the year. And it's going to get crazier. It's going to get crazier.
Especially, the VP announcement obviously changed that, but at this point in time in any other election year, we'd be inundated with election talk, and it's been relatively quiet as far as the election cycle's going, and that's going to heat up at some point. I think the Harris announcement probably jump-started a lot of that, but Biden's obviously been keeping quiet and keeping a lot of that out of the headlines.
Well, but part of that is Trump just soaks up so much media attention, and everything he's doing is about politics. And part of it is thus far, Biden has been running ahead by a fairly comfortable margin, both in the national polls and the state polls. And if that's the case, then you keep your mouth shut and let your opponent keep digging a hole.
Right.
Now that may change, but you basically, if you're ahead, then you can run a fairly cautious strategy, and that's what he's been doing. I'm sure they're going to ramp things up, but part of it is just you don't get the candidates going to as many events in different states and all the media coverage that comes from that.
Right. The stump speeches and all that.
Exactly.
In 2016, you wrote a piece in Vox talking about research that suggested his victory was driven by racial resentment more than anything else.
Yeah.
Given the current environment, what do you think that does to his support this year?
Well, let me just qualify. I wrote that in this early summer of 16, so it was before he won the election, even before I think he got in the nomination. But the argument that I made there was, which was an argument that other scholars made and have done with different data at different points in time, that basically suggested that what was really driving support for Trump, both versus his Republican rivals for the nomination and also versus Hillary Clinton, was racial resentment. It was a belief that African Americans were getting unfair special treatment. It was that immigrants were a threat to the United States. It was that Obama was a Muslim. Other people have extended that and pointing out that different measures of what they call hostile sexism was also a motivation. And I think nothing since then has made me, both in terms of what I've read in the newspaper and what I've read in terms of scholarly analysis of Trump support, have made me change that. In fact, I think it's pretty clear that Trump has chosen this strategy of attempting to double down on appeals to racially, religiously, gender-oriented, conservative, older whites. And you can see that with, he's already resurrecting the birther canards against Kamala Harris.
Yeah. Swarms of low-income housing are coming to the suburbs.
He basically flat out said that, there are too many non-whites in the suburbs. He says 35%. I think it should be lower than that.
Yeah.
And essentially after 2012, the Republican Party had to make a choice about which way we want to go. Do you want to double down on sort of white votes, or do you want to start to appeal to Latinos, Asians, maybe some African Americans, younger voters, by becoming a more moderate party, attempting to reach maybe a deal on immigration and stuff like that? And there was a whole autopsy that the Reince Priebus and the RNC did that said, yeah, that's the direction we got to go in. Yeah. Trump proved that wrong. Trump proved that if you can sort of the share of white voters, especially older white voters without college educations, is a shrinking share of the electorate. But if you can sort of, milk that for even more support than they've been getting, that's also a winning strategy. And that's what he's been doing, and that's what he's doing in this election. It's a strategy that gets tougher and tougher every year just because the demographics of the country change. To me, the interesting thing about 2020 is that Biden is thus far, if you look at the polls, kind of directly challenging that, which is that he's running better among sort of older whites, especially in the Midwest. And that's part of the reason, or the major reason, why he's been running ahead. There's a lot of talk about him needing to excite the base, to get young voters out there and things like that. But if he can peel off even a small percentage of people who stayed home or were Trump voters who basically didn't like Hillary Clinton, maybe for good reasons, maybe for bad reasons, that's a winning strategy too.
Yeah. Do you think the Biden numbers against older whites is driven by COVID and Trump's push to ignore COVID? I mean, those are people who are at the highest risk in saying, I'm staying home and I don't want to die, so I'm going to vote for the guy who doesn't want me to die.
Yeah, it doesn't help. Yeah, it really doesn't help. And I think, I haven't sort of done a deep dive into it. I think that's probably one of the things there. It could also be that, and it goes with the COVID thing, that Trump really does seem to be kind of winging it here in a moment of national crisis. And that this is a sort of demographic that's looking for maybe something more serious, but that's just speculation on my part.
Yeah. Back to the race bit for a second. One of the things that I had hoped prior to COVID, prior to the Black Lives Matter movement, there was the hope that the base that he whipped up with, racial fear last election would die down, and a lot of his base would just get tired of it and stay home. The anti-Hillary vote would go away. They'd get bored of, two old white guys and stay home. To that regard, do you think what has happened with the social justice movement, Black Lives Matter, is that whipping up that fear again? And is there a concern that base starts to turn out again? I mean, the numbers aren't suggesting it right now.
Yeah. Believe me, he's trying.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, it's pretty explicit. It's, vote for me or roving bands, marauding bands of gangs and criminals are going to come into your, white neighborhood and raise hell. I was happened to be up in Wisconsin, and that's the ad. I mean, it's this mother and her child sort of cowering in their home.
Right.
But it doesn't seem to be working that well, in part because, the people who worry about that already are voting for him. And and part of in some ways, it's one of the sort of major changes in American political and social life in my lifetime is the immense drop in crime rates over the last 30 years. Mm-hmm. I have this conversation with my students all the time and say, you really don't know how bad crime rates were in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And there's still crime, obviously, but places like New York and even Chicago and others have crime rates which are much, much lower than they were in the 1970s, 1980s, and in the 1990s.
Sure.
I mean, I was living in DC, and there are neighborhoods that when I lived there in the early 90s, were just war zones. And
sure.
Now there's a Whole Foods. And
right.
I
remember walking through Penn Station or the Port Authority in New York City when I was a kid. The amount of muggings and awful things I saw as a little kid walking through there, it did feel like a war zone. And now those places are, Port Authority is still not that great, but it's nowhere near what it was.
Right. Well, and in 1988, when Michael Dukakis ran against George W. Bush runs a Willie Horton ad, runs these crime ads.
Yeah.
Those kind of ads really had much more bite because people really were much more fearful of crime. That's not the case now. And also, the fact that people are seeing examples in very real time via video of some really egregious instances of police brutality. And that has really kind of changed the conversation. So even if people are concerned about crime, it's pretty tough to look at those videos and say, totally righteous and so on. So I think people, don't like crime and want to see crime reduced, but there's also very much a sense that the police need to respond in much more sort of effective and humane ways.
Right.
So it limits thus far the ability. And the other part of it is also Trump is so polarizing that anything he's for, a chunk of the electorate is going to be against.
Yep.
And one of the things that we've seen while Trump's been in some ways, he's the liberal dream. Since Trump's been in office, support for immigration has gone up. Support for legalizing the status of undocumented immigrants has gone up. Support for Obamacare has gone up. Political scientists talk about it as a thermostatic effect. And so if Joe Biden gets elected, those numbers are going to start to go down.
Right.
But Trump has really kind of exacerbated that in the sense that anything he does, a certain segment of the electorate is just going to be against it. And so once he touches something, it inevitably becomes sort of, either you're for him or you're against it. And if he's for it, you're against it, and vice versa.
Yeah. Is he going to leave when he loses?
Well, he's clearly attempting to muddy the waters for the election with all of this talking about
voter fraud.
And they've been doing this for years. I mean, in 2012, he tweeted out, early on election night, Romney had a lead in the polls on election night. And he tweeted out, typical Trump fashion, it's a travesty. How can you, lose the popular vote, and win the electoral college? Well, of course, he flipped that around in 2016.
Right.
In 2018, he complained about how, the late count in California. And in 2016, he complained that, millions of undocumented people voted, and that's why he lost the popular vote. So he's been doing this for a long time, and he's doing it now with all of the complaints about mail-in voting and this idea that maybe we should put off the election, the attacks on the post office, all these things saying that, the Russia investigation and then the impeachment essentially cheated him out of his first term, and therefore he should get more time on it. It's not like, where, referees in sports can add time on the clock for a penalty.
Right.
Something like that.
Right.
So, and also it's just Trump. He can never sort of do anything graciously.
Right.
And he can never be wrong. He can only be wronged. So even if he loses 50 states and only gets 20% of the popular vote, he's going to claim, fraud.
Yeah.
Speaking of political film, there's a great scene in Citizen Kane where, he's running for governor and he's losing, and his minions at the newspaper have two alternative headlines.
Right.
Kane wins or fraud of the polls.
Yeah.
He's going to claim fraud of the polls. And he, whatever, if he has even a momentary lead on election night, he's going to claim, oh, that was it. And then all these, fake numbers came in afterwards and so on. And my concern is not so much that he's not going to leave, but that Biden comes into office and Trump's going to be out there tweeting every day and claiming it was fraud, that Biden is illegitimate. Republicans will go into full obstruction mode, which is what they did in 2009.
Yeah.
Even if Democrats win back the Senate, it's not clear they can get something through without getting rid of the filibuster, which doesn't seem likely. That we're going to be in a situation of very serious deadlock at a time when we have these multiple crises.
Yeah.
All of which you've mentioned, the pandemic, all the associated economic trouble related to it, all of the problems regarding police violence, and essentially that Biden will be so hamstrung by both obstruction in Congress and whatever resistance can be whipped up by Trump and others out in the country, that it could get very, very messy, even if Biden wins.
All right. Well, good talk. I'm going to go curl up in a fetal position and call it a night.
Exactly. Yep.
As someone who, the career is based on data and fact, does the current environment drive you absolutely batty that, polls are called into question, data's called into question, no one knows what's real anymore? Is that driving you nuts?
Yeah, I mean, it should drive anybody nuts.
Yeah.
Polling's always had its issues, and people have always said, polling this, whatever, and that's.
But we can't get an accurate read. I mean, no one can get an accurate read of what the hell's going on with COVID, right? I mean, argue the data on that.
Yeah, and increasingly people are politicized. Everything is politicized, is what it comes down to. Everything is politicized. It used to be, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts. Well, no, now everybody feels entitled to their own facts, and everything is politicized. And in the past, you had, a general consensus about both parties that there were certain things that were just kind of baselines that you had to go by, the census and, stuff like that. No, everything is politicized. And increasingly, political scientists use the term of meta-identity. That we all identify with different groups. We may identify with our religious group or our hometown or our home state or our sports team or what college we went to. But increasingly partisanship has become this meta-identity, that everything is determined by what party we belong to and how we look at the world, and we will only trust information that comes from our side. And we will give up these other identities in order to maintain that meta identity. So your favorite sport, forget it. I'm not watching football anymore because, those people are taking a knee. Or, Coach so-and-so said something really stupid. So that's it. Home state, what college we went to, alums, if they like or dislike what's going on at the college, they may choose to sever their ties. All because of this partisan meta identity. And essentially, this goes on both sides, but I think it does a disservice to say that it's perfectly symmetrical. Republicans have really weaponized this. And as much as there are things that Democrats do along these lines, Republicans have really taken it to a much higher level. So, especially now with COVID, and just, the most ridiculous stuff like, wearing a mask. I mean, sure, it's an inconvenience, but my God, to make it seem like, you're being forced into a gulag or something because you have to put on a mask is just, these are people, you have to wear shoes when you go into the store.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, here it's hot here. I'd love to go in barefoot, whatever. But again, it serves a partisan purpose, and therefore we'll do it.
Zero room for nuance anymore in our world.
No,
right?
you pick a side, and
Right.
that is the only identity that matters.
Yeah.
And once that tribal group says this is the way it's going to be, then you've got to join up.
And that's how you understand how real fake news, Cambridge Analytica and there's the child trafficking movement that's going on now.
And QAnon. Yeah. And it's self-reinforcing because QAnon is a good example.
Yeah.
If you can paint your enemies as child molesters, I mean, there's nothing worse than that.
Right.
Then of course you're not going to believe what they have to say. They're child molesters.
Right.
And it's interesting. I'm audio listening to a new biography of Joe McCarthy, and it really is interesting how McCarthy did all this stuff back in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. He figured out that, accuse your enemies of the worst thing. Back then it was being a communist. Now it's being a child molester.
Yep.
But he didn't stop from stooping to that level too. He was basically able to sort of play the media, and the media, the sense that you have to present both sides, no matter how ridiculous one side is. So it became, McCarthy alleges, no matter how fantastic the allegation, that became the news story. And then maybe, 6 paragraphs down, they point out that, well, the Democrats or the State Department, pointed out that, this is absolutely fabrication.
Right.
And essentially the unwillingness to ever admit that you're wrong. And it's just really interesting that essentially we sort of went through this. But McCarthy was only a senator, Trump is president, but they used very much the same tactics.
And you can make that direct connection from McCarthy to Trump with Roy Cohn. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's just amazing when you see that Roy Cohn playbook, and then you see what Trump is doing. I mean, it is to a T everything he learned from Roy Cohn. It's scary.
Yeah. But McCarthy actually developed this before Roy Cohn was on the scene. So, but Roy Cohn, if anything, learned it from McCarthy, and then perhaps pass it on to Trump.
Right.
And just a sort of utter shamelessness on the, that you could accuse them of anything, and they never would sort of say, oh, well, I guess, kind of, no, they just, never admit defeat and just keep going forward.
Just keep going. And if you just go back over the course of the 4 years of this term, how many different controversies would have completely sunk any president? And we can't even remember them.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, if you had said at any point prior to something happening, do you think this would sink Trump? And people would say, oh my God, yes. So if you had said, gee, in September of 2016, you said, we're going to get a tape of Trump saying really nasty things about women. All right. What do you think is going to happen? People go, oh, well, that's the end.
Right.
We're going to get a transcript of a phone call where he's, attempting to extort the president of Ukraine to dig up dirt on a political enemy. Oh, well, that'll be the end. But he knows that essentially that the Republican Party and that his supporters are invested in him.
Yeah.
And there's a great book about Trump written by a couple Washington Post reporters back in 2016. And it's basically just a biography of Trump. It's pretty good. And one of the things that is really, to me, stuck out as a really kind of crucial moment in sort of Trump's emergence as Trump was in the early 90s when the casino empire was going belly up. And he had the epiphany that he couldn't go bankrupt, that any value those investments, those casinos had was because of the Trump name. But if he went bankrupt, then the bank stood to lose everything. Mm. And he realized at that point that he had the advantage, that the banks could never abandon him totally, because then they would lose everything. They're going to lose a lot, but they will lose everything. And he realized that at that point, he actually had the leverage over the banks. And I think he's realized that because he has such strong support, that essentially the Republican Party is deeply invested in him. And if he goes down completely, then they go down as well. So they will defend him. And he will never let a sense of shame force him off the stage.
Right.
So if Mitt Romney, again, it's unthinkable, that Mitt Romney could have one of these Access Hollywood tapes.
Right.
But if,
Right.
Some weird, bizarre world where we heard Mitt Romney say those things, Mitt Romney would have been deeply, deeply ashamed and talked about how he disappointed his family, and he'd, slink off the stage into
oblivion. Do the apology tour and
right. Exactly. Trump, nope. Just keep going right ahead. And there's a lesson there in terms of politics and maybe some other things.
Well, I wonder, does this, I hate the term new normal. It's been used far too often. It's like a drinking game, but is this the new normal? Are more politicians going to learn from his behavior? And I think there's this hope that Biden wins and we go back to the way it used to be, where everyone's respectable and, has some sort of moral compass, but not to say Biden won't, but I just wonder if a lot of those things you can get away with more now, I guess.
I think there are two things to separate out. One is Trump as Trump, and he is just a sort of, in some ways, sort of unique psychological figure in the American landscape.
Yeah.
And the other is sort of the where the Republican Party had been heading before Trump, and I think that they were heading in this a number of the issues that Trump has played off of, the sort of white nationalism, the sort of racial resentments. That was growing in the Republican Party. It's been growing for decades. Trump was able to sort of take that and exacerbate those trends. So that even if Trump is off the scene and you have a more psychologically normal president who's a Republican and a deeply conservative Republican, I think you will still see a lot of what's been happening going on. And the other part of it is just the environment, that this sort of negative partisanship where the other side is the enemy. And, you cannot compromise. If you are in opposition, then you have to obstruct rather than work with them. That's going to go on. Because that's been building for years and was building before Trump got on. And in many ways, it sort of helped lead to Trump. That if the other side is really, really that terrible, then, hey, why not get Trump? Because he's willing to be your defender against.
He'll do whatever
he's evil. Yeah, he'll do whatever it takes because, hey, there's the old saying, he may be an SOB, but he's our SOB.
Right.
And we need an SOB like that because our enemies are so bad.
Well, does that mean then that the Republican Party has just abandoned people of color? Are they the white party?
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, I think in many ways. Yeah. And honestly, they have for a while now. I mean, they've given up African-American voters back in the 1960s. And when I did my dissertation back in the early 90s, I interviewed a former chair of the RNC, a guy named Bill Brock. He's passed away now. And in the 1970s, he actually invited Jesse Jackson to come talk to the Republican National Committee. And they started this very high profile program to sort of reach out to blacks and so on. And I asked him, I said, did you really think you were going to, move the needle on the African-American vote? And he was pretty honest. He said, no, we knew we weren't going to get any black votes. But what we wanted to do was we wanted to signal to more moderate suburban whites that we were not a racist party. And, so they make these kind of noises and things like that. But, I'm a big believer that, people know their interests and they vote that way. And since the 1960s, basically about, 85, 90% of African-Americans have voted for the Democratic candidate. And just like, evangelicals and Catholics and, Hamilton grads or whatever, know their own interests and they know what parties best represent them. I think that's true for African Americans as it is for any other group in society. And the Republicans know this too. The other thing the Republicans have is that they could make those efforts, but they fear doing that undermines their support among more racially conservative whites. And that those racially conservative whites might then say, well, gee, if there's no difference between the parties on this issue, I might as well vote my pocketbook, and maybe that's with the Democrats. So they worry about sort of losing the base that they have. in order to maybe improve their vote with another group. So they'll take the safe course, which is we'll stick with the base that we have.
That leads me then, I think, a little bit to your book, The Unsteady March, which I'm sure people have had a renewed interest in given recent events. But in that book, there's the idea that civil rights advancement came at times when there was the country had a need for African Americans or people of color. Given what's going on now, where does that stand? I mean, is the need to mobilize and get them out to vote, or do you see an advancement point now, or is this, where are we now?
It's a good question. So the argument is that they needed African Americans to win wars.
Right.
That during certain wars in American history, Revolution, Civil War, and then World War II and the Cold War, we needed African Americans as soldiers, defense workers, or at the very least as sort of loyal and quiescent citizens. But therefore there was, and also we were fighting against enemies that we thought challenge our liberal values for our value of democracy, equality, liberty, and those sorts of things. And we had this massive contradiction at home, so we had to do something about it to better fight that war, and also because our consciousness got raised. And then outside of those wars, things actually stalled out or went into retreat. The question is what's going on now, and I think that to a large extent, not entirely, but to a large extent, Trump is part of that sort of backlash that we've seen after each of these movements. That began, like I said before, it began before Trump, but Trump has really sort of taken that to another level. But the progress has been made. It hasn't been permanent, but it has to some extent been cumulative. So the question is whether or not we've reached a kind of tipping point where, because of the previous things like the Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, inclusion of African Americans, Latinos, changes in immigration laws, that there are enough, that essentially non-whites have enough political power. There are enough whites who are comfortable with an inclusive democracy that they can prevail. But essentially the fights we're having now are exactly the same fights that we had in this previous period of what do we do after these egalitarian moments, which is the Reconstruction era. Who can vote? To what extent do we allow armed violence to determine political outcomes? To what extent are we willing to tolerate electoral fraud? And really the sort of, not the ending of democracy, but essentially the diminishing or the limitation of democracy to only certain groups, because we fear political power by a different racial group. And so people say, we've never seen something like this before in American history. I'll point out that no, we essentially had, one-party authoritarian rule in a third of the United States for most of its history, and America is only, I would argue, could be called a sort of full democracy, essentially, in my lifetime. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's in many ways the sort of moment we're comparing to is not the norm but the exception, and the question is whether or not we're going to go back to the norm, which is a sort of racially exclusionary democracy.
A lot riding on this election season, huh?
Yeah, but it's not going away. It's not going away. I mean, like I said before, this is stuff that was emerging long before Trump was on the scene. But Trump just came in there with a can of gasoline and poured it all over and started flipping matches around.
Oy.
So how are you doing?
Like I said, I'm going to curl up in a fetal position after this conversation.
Yeah, I should. Should have had a couple of drinks for this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's talk Hamilton.
Yeah, sure.
You've been there a long time. You were when I was there, you were like the young, cool professor, and now you're I'm just the old, slightly older, cool professor.
Yeah, no. So when did you graduate?
99.
99. Okay, so I got there my first semester was in DC. I did the DC program my very first semester. So I didn't actually like teach on the Hamilton campus until 96, first semester 96. So yeah, so I've been there 25 years. I got there in the fall 95. This will be 25 years. But it feels like yesterday.
Sure.
Time flies.
Sure.
Yeah.
How's the school changed over that time, do you think?
Boy, good question. A couple of things. One, the students have always been good, but the student body's gotten better. I mean, it's just clearly become much more selective. And I think it's more that there was kind of a tail there of students who, good kids, but academically were not as good as the others. And that's kind of disappeared. I used to feel like I was a hard grader, and maybe I'm just getting old and soft, but that lower tail has just kind of disappeared. I'd give out, a handful of D's and a bunch of C's and stuff. I find it really hard to justify those grades anymore because they're just not earning. They're doing good work. What else is doing it? The school has gotten more diverse, both in terms of the faculty, the staff, the student body. It's along very different lines, especially along sort of racial, ethnic lines. Also in terms of geography, I think it's changed quite a bit. It feels a lot more kind of hipper. All right, maybe I've gotten less hip, but the school's gotten more hip. So in the old Hamilton, the old unhip Hamilton, then I was hip. But maybe my hipness has remained constant. It's just that Hamilton has gotten hipper.
I imagine there's a direct correlation between the diversity of the campus and how hip it is.
Yeah. And I got there just after they got rid of the houses, the fraternity houses.
Yep.
And I know, I'll probably get lots of angry emails about it. I think that was a really good move on the part of Hamilton.
It's come up quite a bit on this show for those of us who were there at the same time. And that was, my class was, I've talked about this on the show, but my class was the first class to come in after that decision. And, very much I feel like those of us that were there during my class lived through the transition of, what it was going to be like after. So there was a lot of growing pains that happened. But I think everyone I've talked to who's lived through the decision afterwards, you can't argue with the fact that it was the right decision. I think there were some Greek members who...
Oh, people make that argument, believe me. I still hear it. I still hear it.
Yeah.
I just can't see a scenario where all of the things that we think have improved at Hamilton over the last 25 years would have happened if we remained with the Greek system as strong as it was then, and with the houses. I just can't see it. And I think Hamilton would have become a real kind of outlier within our peer group. And it would have been harder for us to compete with an SF schools. And, and again, maybe we would have had a niche there, but it would have been a pretty narrow niche.
Much has been written over the years about the college campus and the notion of free speech, right? It was a liberal haven back in the day. And then, anyone who had a different opinion, like, what was it, Ward Churchill, I think, it was a big controversy at Hamilton. Has the student body changed in a way that you have to be careful about what you say?
Well, that is the other thing. The student bodies become more liberal, but, it's not really the professor. I mean, the joke among professors is, how are we going to indoctrinate students who won't even read the syllabus? And what I point out is that the Hamilton student body has definitely gotten more liberal since I have got there in the mid-1990s. But the groups that we're drawing from have gotten more liberal in that same time. It used to be that, the Northeast was, fairly divided politically. 1988, George H.W. Bush won Connecticut, won New Hampshire, won Vermont. And those states have now become, very, democratic. It used to be that highly educated professionals were fairly conservative. Well, now they're fairly liberal. It used to be the Democrats were the party of people who didn't have a college education, and Republicans were the party of people who did have a college education. Among whites, that's flipped around now.
Yeah.
The Northeast generally. And the other thing is, Hamilton draws largely from a secular kind of environment. We don't have in the Northeast, we don't have a lot of evangelicals. Maybe if we're in Texas, it'd be very different. We're basically drawing from, urban Catholics and mainline Protestants. Well, they've, been fairly liberal, especially in the Northeast. So, I think like in the 1990s, we probably reflected the pool that we were drawing from. And that's true now. So yeah, like when I got there was a very active, Republican conservative. Actually, then there were two groups. There were the Republicans and the conservatives. And I'm not quite sure what the split was, but boy, the real enemy was the other one and not the Democrats. But now, and again, I haven't seen any, systematic effort. I think Stephen in the econ department polled on this in 2004. Something like 80% of students voted for Kerry and like 10% for Bush and 10% for Nader or something like that. And my guess is those numbers are probably as high or higher now than they were.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. But do you think that, back to the point about the tribal nature of all this, if I don't know, I struggle to find the right example, and then, Alex Jones was invited to speak on campus. I'm sure he wouldn't be, but what would that reaction be on a more liberal campus like Hamilton, do you think?
Well, we had this. There was a speaker who was invited to speak in a class, a guy named Paul Gottfried a couple years ago, and there was some protest, but he spoke in the class. And, the students were, protesting, and they didn't like march in there and try and, stomp them or something like that.
Yeah.
The numbers are pretty clear. Professors tend to be fairly liberal in their politics these days. I find students tend to be really kind of largely uninvolved in these issues, which I think speaks well of them, that for most of them, politics, they may be liberal or, or moderate or, whatever. Politics is not their major focus.
Is that frustrating for you as someone who that's a big part?
No, it's kind of heartwarming.
Okay.
They're worried, they want to hang out with their friends and they want to, watch TV or go to parties and things like that rather than, spend all their time like me staring at a screen and looking at polling data.
Well, that's good because I think people hear that the students are so much better now than they were before, that there's this perception of there is no fun and it is all just work and an obsession with that. So it's good to hear that there is.
Well, I will say
are still college students.
Yeah. Well, I will say that, but I will say that compared to when I got to Hamilton, and certainly when I was in college, students now are much smarter, much harder working, much better behaved. This idea that somehow this is a generation of reprobates and, there's a temptation, to always see the generations behind you as going to hell in a handbasket.
Sure.
That's absolutely not true. Students today behave much better. When I was in college, this is true. I told students this. When I was in college, the only rule we had on alcohol was no kegs in the bathtub. And that was just to protect the bathtubs. Because you chip the porcelain and it's really expensive to fix. That was it, and anything went. And there are, I think, some differences in sort of binge drinking and things like that. But I think in general, students are much more, like I said, smarter and focused and better behaved than they were when I was in college. And a lot of the stuff that was just normal back then, the campus is going to be trashed every weekend. Now that's, that behavior is not put up with. A couple of guys getting in a fight in the past. Well, don't do it again. Now, boom, you're gone.
Yeah.
General,
I see it in interviewing and hiring people out of college.
Yeah.
They show up, with a portfolio of work, and I'm like, this is I work in advertising. No, it's a job for advertising, not in creative. You don't need a portfolio. And no, here's writing samples, and here's all this. And I was lucky if my resume didn't have misspellings on it.
Yeah. Well, I think this goes with the sense that the stakes are so much higher.
Yeah.
The downside of this is that there is a real crisis of mental health among college students. And I think that there's a sense that they've got to do everything right, and they can't make any mistakes, and they're so worried about it. So that while there are a lot of good qualities, I worry at what cost it's having on the students. That not so much that they're not having fun, they just need to understand that it just doesn't matter that much.
Right. Well, I imagine they come in that way because I think that pressure begins at the high school level of trying to get into these colleges, right?
Oh, it begins at home and so on. Yeah. And to kind of take it back to politics, I've been thinking about this over the last couple of years. I graduated from high school in 1981, and at that point, it was a real question about whether you went to college, because the gap in earnings between a college graduate and a high school graduate was probably the narrowest there ever was. And that world was going to change very quickly. It was going to disappear, but we didn't know that at the time. So, I grew up in a factory town in Iowa, and, if you went to work at the local factory, you made good money. Like I said, those jobs are all gone, but we didn't know that. So the sense of going to college, even if you went to college and you really screwed up, you could go home, you work at the factory, you had a good life.
Sure.
And even if you went to college and you did okay versus you did great, there wasn't that big of a gap because, people weren't pulling down billions of dollars in Silicon Valley or Wall Street. And now I think everybody is parents, kids are so attuned to the difference between success and failure, that the payoff difference between success and failure has become so huge.
Yeah.
And the sense that it really is, this very narrow line to walk, and that if you got to stay on top of this balance beam, I'm mixing a lot of metaphors here, because if you stay on top of it, then, you can just get riches beyond your wildest dreams. Or if you fall off, then, your life is a terrible disaster.
Right.
And so I worry that this sort of, the inequality we're seeing in society is, drifting down to students, and this idea that in order for them to succeed, our notion of success is totally different now. It used to be, you made a couple $100,000 as a lawyer, well, that's nothing. My friend made $5 billion when his, the IPO at his tech company, came out.
Right.
That it's creating all this anxiety about success and failure with students, and causing them an incredible amount of angst and worse.
And you see that with students as they determine what to do after college.
I don't know what to do, but just the sense that it really matters, whether they get a B or a C or an A in the class, and what their resume looks like, and whether they have a portfolio when they go in for this job, and stuff like that. Everything seems much more precarious to them, and to a large extent it is. And so in many ways it's kind of rational, but nonetheless it's having really pretty terrible effects on many of them.
And I can't imagine what now this pandemic is doing on top of that, and ruining in many regards any semblance of a normal college experience, and then to come out into a job market that it's not helping.
Yeah, and we don't know. I mean, the analogy I use is it's like Wile E. Coyote going. We've gone off the cliff, but we haven't
still running up in the air.
Yeah. The long term, but we don't even know the short term damage, but the long term damage of this is going to be. We barely kind of come out of, and for a lot of people, they never came out of the recession of 2008, 2009, and now we're going into this, and we have no idea how this is going to go. The hope is, knock on wood, that we'll get a vaccine, that we can start to, move back, but we don't know. And, but also, certain things are just never going to be the same. Retail's never going to be the same.
Yeah.
The restaurant industry is never going to be the same.
Right.
So many other things. We just don't know what's going to happen.
So many businesses, commuting, so many businesses going remote now, people realizing they can do their jobs from home. Why do I need to do the commute? And what's that going to do to cities, right? There was this urbanization movement for so long. You can see that starting to stall and reverse when people are saying, wait a minute, I can do my job and go live in the country somewhere. I'm going to go do that. Yeah. Wherever I can find a good Wi-Fi, I can work.
Yeah, and also it's just exacerbating the inequality that was there to begin with.
Right.
That if you had a fairly stable job that was in the sort of knowledge tech industry kind of thing, then you were fine. You got to you work from home. There are all sorts of challenges associated with that if you had kids and those sorts of things. But if you worked in the restaurant industry or food industry or any number of things, boy, you might just be left high and dry. Retail. Right. And that's, again, we don't know how deep that wound is at this point. We know it's there.
Yeah.
But yeah, we have no idea what the sort of economic and social impact of that's going to be going forward in a year, 5, 10 years.
So what movies should I be watching? Let me get ready for class. What movies am I watching?
Oh, well, what movies to watch? Boy, it depends on what you want. So,
I'm talking about for your class. So prep me for your class.
The Candidate. We were talking about that. Watch again. Yeah. I think that's, it came out in 1972. It stars Robert Redford. And I just started rewatching it. It was on I noticed it was on HBO. And boy, that movie is still fresh today as it was almost 50 years ago. If you've ever worked on a campaign, that movie will ring true to you. At all of the sort of banality, stupidity of campaigns, the tendency to make winning trump everything else. Whatever sort of ideals and desires you had going in, you want to win, and you're going to do whatever it takes to do that. So that's one that we're going to watch. We watched some of the classics, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which I hate personally. I really hate that. But it's, hate watching is a good thing. I have a whole section.
Just because you hate it because it's just saccharine and, too ideological?
No, it's not even that. It's that it glorifies the filibuster.
Right.
And which at the time they made it, the only thing they used the filibuster for was Southern senators used it to stop anti-lynching laws.
Right.
So here was this little used procedure used for the worst thing you can imagine. And Frank Capra goes and says, you know what? I'm going to make a movie that makes this filibuster central to the plot and glorifies it.
Yeah.
And so I hate that movie. Some of my former students know I do a lot of hating on classic movies, like To Kill a Mockingbird. Hate that movie. Atticus Finch, worst lawyer in the world. Worst lawyer in the world. No white lawyer in Alabama in the 1930s ever thought they were going to get a black defendant off on a rape charge. All right. It just didn't happen. Tom Robinson knew the score. Right. Tom Robinson says Atticus like, you go do your appeal. Worst lawyer in the world. So, what else are we watching there? So we got a whole section at the end on what I'm calling the MAGA movies. So how do we understand sort of Trump conservatism? We tend to think of Hollywood as being sort of very liberal, and it is, but we're watching some movies that I think have helped sort of inform conservative politics. So in that we're Dirty Harry, hugely influential. Red Dawn.
Oh yeah.
Ghostbusters. People sort of do a double take when it's home. Ghostbusters is a conservative movie. So who's the villain in Ghostbusters?
The mayor.
No, the EPA bureaucrat.
Well, right.
The EPA bureaucrat. So
right.
That's right. Bureaucrat.
That's right.
And then The Incredibles, which, and again, those are all good movies in the sense they're entertaining to watch, but they have very deeply conservative politics. So we do that. We got a whole section of movies about race and civil rights, movies about media, Facing the Crowd, old Andy Griffith movie, playing totally against type. We think Andy Griffith is Sheriff Taylor,
right?
The sort of avuncular homespun sheriff. He plays this kind of braying, maniacal country music singer who, through television, becomes a political figure. And sort of some antecedents of Trump, but made in the 1950s. Great movie. Network, another great movie about the media.
Yep.
So that's kind of a preview there.
Well, I'm gonna go do family movie with The Incredibles, and my kids will be happy to watch it, and I'm gonna take notes and watch it a different way.
There you go. It's a great movie. It's an incredibly entertaining movie. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it definitely has a politics to it. So,
Sure. One of the things I'm curious about, as someone who is active on Twitter, and as I've told many people, and many people have told me, a great follow on Twitter. Does that serve in the old adage of publish or perish? Is that another way for that? Or no, it's not. No, you say no. I mean, I know you have fun. You clearly have fun with it, but then you also have some thoughtful things that you use the platform for.
Occasionally the thoughtfulness slips through. No, I wish it counted. So
I know it doesn't count, but
it doesn't count.
Well, but it raises the profile.
It raises the profile. I mean, I enjoy it because it does let you communicate with an audience of fellow political scientists in a kind of real-time way.
Yeah.
To hear what they're thinking and sort of bounce ideas off and so on. A number of journalists also use it and lets you sort of communicate with them. And that's good. I enjoy that. So in that sense, it does kind of raise the profile a little bit. But, then the other 90% is just the usual snark and trolling that we all know and love,
of course,
Twitter for.
Of course.
So, yeah.
But it fuels part of this other phenomenon, which I'm interested in as it relates to the work you do, of just the speed at which we all live now, right? The world happens so fast. So as someone who's a researcher, how does that, does that hinder your ability to do work? I mean, research takes time and you want to, pour over data and formulate a thought. And I feel like by the time you do that, oftentimes the world has moved on to something else.
True. I think one of the things that I find very encouraging about political science, and history has done this too, is an increasing desire of political scientists and sort of respect for public-facing scholarship. And that can take many forms. Twitter, there are people, I mean, I can't say I do that, but there are people who do these very long Twitter threads, which are incredibly thoughtful analysis and explication of a particular issue. There are a number of historians who've done this and others.
Matt Glassman, class of 2000, tries to do this, but he failed.
Matt Glassman does. Yeah, no, he does it. And Matt's a great example of this. And there are many others. Increasing, a willingness to sort of put research out there in ways that are more sort of publicly accessible. So the piece that I wrote in 2016 that you mentioned was in Vox, and that's not a political science journal. It doesn't sort of count as sort of capital political science, that kind of stuff. But you Google my name, and that's what you're going to get. And it allows you to sort of maybe have a say in the conversation. And
makes it more accessible for more people.
Yeah, it does. And personally, I think that's been one of the best things that's happened in political science in the last couple of years. And I'm really proud of my colleagues, Sharon Rivera and Erica DeBrune in the government department, who and Bimini Johnson and others who, and I'm not trying to leave anybody out, who've been able to sort of do good scholarship, but do it in this sort of public-facing way and inform a sort of broader audience. And again, it's not going to count as much as peer-reviewed journal articles or books or things like that. But I think Hamilton's been good about encouraging that. The advancement office has always been very helpful in trying to get out there. And I think it's important, especially for schools like Hamilton, to sort of, be part of this conversation.
Yeah.
We've got to sort of get our name out there to potential students and their families. And this is a way to do it. So it hits a number of sort of notes. And like I said, Hamilton has been sort of very helpful and encouraging of that kind of work.
Thinking back to arriving on campus, in 96, I guess, as you said, anything you wish you had known looking back?
Oh, man. That it snowed in May?
And in 1996, it did. I remember.
It snowed on Mother's Day.
Yep, I remember.
And we're not talking dusting. We're talking actual accumulation.
I took a final. It was my last final that day. I drove home. I was living in New Jersey at the time. I was in shorts and a t-shirt at home in New Jersey after trudging through snow to take my last final. You couldn't get me off that campus fast enough.
Yeah, and I grew up in Iowa. I went to school outside Chicago. I mean, I knew winters, but it's like it doesn't. May? What the heck is going on here?
I remember.
What did I wish I know? Overall, by far, Hamilton has been a great environment. The students have been absolutely fantastic. And really now the best part of my job is is talking with former students. When I go down and do the DC program, about once every couple of weeks, I'm walking down the street in DC and I'll hear Professor Klinkner, and I'll see somebody with a Hamilton sweatshirt on or something, and I'll walk up. It was a former student. That is absolutely the best part. I've had some really fantastic colleagues over the years, and that's been great. And it's been, especially in my department, I will say, we've done a lot of hiring over the last couple of years, and I've been very fortunate that I like all of my colleagues, but I'm really fortunate that we've been able to bring in this cohort of junior faculty in the last roughly 7 or 8 years that have really kind of transformed the department. And it's just been really great to work with them. I guess I should say I've helped mentor them, but actually it's gone the other way, if anything. That's been really great. Overall, it's just been a really fantastic experience, except for those, May snowstorms.
If you're a current student, don't make the same mistake I made. Be sure to take a class with that man. He's easy to talk to. Clearly, there's a lot to learn from him. Take advantage of the time you have on that campus and learn from the likes of Phil Klinkner. My thanks to Professor Klinkner for joining us. Insightful conversation. I have a long list of movies to watch now, and I'm going to enjoy doing it and learn something in the process. You have been listening to Had I Known on WHCL-FM, Clinton, New York. HadIKnownShow.buzzsprout.com for all previous episodes, and later on, you'll hear this episode. Had I Known Show on social media. My thanks, as always, to Dr. Michael Woods for supplying all the music on this show. And as always, Doc will play us out. Hope you enjoyed the show. We'll talk to you next week.
Had I Known podcast show on your radio or take it to go.
That was good. You want to try it again?
Yep.
Okay.
Why are we doing it again?